Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation podcast.
Hello and welcome to Mintel Little Conversation, where our experts bring you fresh ideas and new perspectives on how consumers eat, drink, shop, groom and think. I'm Matthew Crabb, Asia Pacific Trends Director here at Mintel, based in Malaysia and working on developing our consumer trends and drivers and how they reflect what consumers want and why. Today I'm joined by Rebecca in the UK, Alex in the US and Woon in Thailand. In that order, can you please briefly introduce yourselves and what you do at Mintel?
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I work in the UK. I'm a senior media analyst and I write reports on a range of topics from books to social media to TV.
Hi, I'm Alex Milanazzo, a trends analyst for North America, and I focus on the US and Canada for cross-category consumer trends coverage.
Hi, my name is Woon Jiradeshakun, and I am a senior lifestyle analyst based in Bangkok, Thailand, and my main responsibilities is writing lifestyle consumers report.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining me and talking about our subject today, which is data privacy. Now, data privacy has been in the news a lot recently. Several ransomware attacks have highlighted how vulnerable governments, institutions, and companies can be to breaches of data security. As Mintel is in the business of being experts in what consumers want and why, today we want to consider what consumer expectations are around the concept of data privacy, what they expect from brands, and in order to protect their data, what benefits they expect to get from sharing their data with brands. So to kick off, I'd just like to ask each of you, what do we think as a group the present and future of data privacy as it applies to each region will be? And what specific examples have we seen that show how consumer behavior is playing out? So I'm going to go first of all with Rebecca.
Yeah, well, I think thinking about Europe and the UK, the sort of world of data privacy really got changed in 2018 with the implementation of GDPR regulation, which is, for those in other markets who might not know, is that General Data Protection Regulation, which sort of gave consumers a lot more ability to control what data was being tracked, what was being given to third parties, and really brought sort of data to the forefront of sort of the public consciousness. And since then, consumers have been vastly more aware because every single time you go onto a new website, you're asked questions about, can we track this data? Sometimes you're given options for how you do that, and you're supposed to be given an opt-out. For the most part, in our consumer research since then, we've shown that most people go for the easiest option of just sort of clicking through, not wanting to look through options about controlling which data goes to these companies. There is a level of engagement with it. And I think overall that has really changed the mindset of people, along with a lot of the controversies that have occurred, such as, most notably the Facebook controversy of data privacy. And I think going forward, therefore, I really characterize how UK consumers see data privacy as increasingly about consent and control, and expecting to be able to have that input as to how their data will be used and expect to be able to control how it's used. So really, we're definitely on that increased awareness pathway.
Excellent. Thanks, Rebecca. And Alex, do you think in the US people are similarly becoming much more engaged with data privacy, or do you think, like many of us, they just click acknowledge on the terms and conditions and carry on?
Yes, and I think it's, all of the above. As Rebecca talked about with the EU's GDPR, that really changed really a global consciousness, I think, around data privacy. And while the US, there is a lack of federal regulation around data privacy and data protection. And so that's, in terms of this region, that's probably the most obvious and likely oncoming development in consumer data privacy, which is especially being motivated by state regulations. We currently here in the US only have 3 states that have comprehensive data protection laws. And those are California, Virginia, and Nevada, I believe. And so 47 of the 50 either have weak or no data protection laws. And so currently, I believe that a lot of US consumers are still in that sort of unearthing phase, I like to call it, where they're learning about what these data collection practices are and how they feel about them, especially since a lot of these processes have been somewhat, intentionally obscured from their understanding. And so I think that the trajectory of consumer sentiment is definitely in line with points that Rebecca made, and the US just isn't quite there in terms of regulation motivating those behavioral changes.
Interesting. So very different sort of set of circumstances in the US already from Europe. Now, Woon, I know that Thailand is bringing in new laws on data privacy, as have been other countries in the Asia Pacific. How much of that is driven by consumer demand?
So actually we are having this PDPA, which is Personal Data Protection Act, but it's been postponed, which means that it's going to be enacted next year. And so right now, but overall picture, I'd say that people are, like in the UK and in the US, which means that we are giving more importance to issues around data privacy. Let's say that comparing to before, when you get like phone calls from salespersons from the brands that you've never bought anything from before, like back then you was just just got annoyed and didn't do anything much with it. But today, people like younger generations, especially millennials and Gen Zs, they have more sense of what is going wrong. They are more skeptical of things that are happening around them, around themselves. So they would ask how and where their personal information has been collected from, something like that. And that is something that has been increasingly happening in Thailand too. And another thing that I've been observing is that because we are spending so much time on social media, and we see that there are so many cases and news around and data breach and data leaks, something like that. So and that's why we are seeing more importance of how data has been protected.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's quite interesting to see the variety of different situations and the speed of uptake and awareness differences between different regions amongst consumers. So following on from that, to look more specifically, I wondered if you can now consider maybe how data privacy is playing out in different categories, and how do we all feel consumer data privacy is salient to and or talked about in, for example, health tech, services, social commerce, smart home devices, all of these sort of things. Has anybody got any initial thoughts on that?
I can go first because I feel like Thailand is, we are one of the countries that, use social media quite a lot, and we shop online quite a lot too. Let's say that if, I think from the study that we had before, we are the third country in the world that has the highest proportion of online shoppers in the world. So you can imagine how much time we spend on social media. So I would say that people in Thailand, we are kind of willing to exchange our data in order to get more convenience, from shopping online. And also, we know that when exchanging this data to the brands, they also give personalized products or some things that are more suitable to their needs. So we are more okay with this. But if we are talking about healthcare or health services and let's say smart home, we can see that we are adopting more products in these categories. But maybe because the usage is still limited in our country, so we haven't really heard of negative news around data privacy issue around this. So I'm not too sure about in the UK and in the US.
Yeah, that's really interesting because certainly in the UK, and I imagine very much the US, there's a lot of controversy around every time there's a big data breach, especially the social networks, any high profile brand. Though I think similarly, we people say they care very much about data privacy and that it influences their behavior to an extent. But as you said, it just instantly, as soon as convenience comes up or there's some other advantage you want, people typically just accept that their data might be compromised slightly. With social media, which has been like at the heart of a lot of these controversies, it will be interesting increasingly to see as these platforms become quite homogenized, there's quite a lot of big players now, whether people do take that into account when choosing, say, which social media they use for commerce, as that becomes a bigger trend. But I still think people pick these sites on other factors, and it has to take a lot of continuous controversy to really push people away, to really feel that their safety in some way was being compromised. We do know from our data that Facebook's reputation has certainly been damaged by its data breaches, but it is also still the most used platform in the UK, despite these. So, again, like people do make these choices on other factors. But if we were thinking about shifting to another market out of social media, I would point to, I think, some of the tech markets, say the voice speakers. I think that does get impacted by the issues of data privacy, and people are uncomfortable having them in, a speaker in their home that might be listening to them. That, I think, is a market where some people will be hesitant to sort of enter into that space.
Yeah, those are great points that Woon and Rebecca brought up, especially the points about convenience. We know that, data collection plays an instrumental role in consumers' convenience, which they prioritize. And I also think when we're thinking about different categories, Rebecca brought up a great point about how consumers feel, how personal it feels to consumers. So, bringing a smart speaker into your home feels very personal. And we know that around 70% of US consumers are concerned about their smart home products getting hacked. And I think they have different metrics, so to speak, of when I'm making a decision, am I specifically vulnerable to hacking or privacy infringement? And so that might be my personal health data, my individual home, versus is the company at risk of a breach? And that may or may not affect me. And so those are examples like Facebook and Target. And so consumers didn't abandon those places. Even the consumers that were affected, didn't necessarily abandon those services. And so it may translate into consumers taking matters into their own hands in certain instances, such as very deliberately choosing, I will not have smart home products, something like that. But what's more likely to happen, since consumers are fairly adamant in not wanting to change their own behavior, they're going to want companies to do it for them, or regulators to really set the standard there. Because we even see this confliction within similar consumer sentiments. We know 46% of social media users in the US agree that social media is designed to manipulate them. And that kind of proportion holds standard across all ages. And then we see that around half of consumers are interested in purchasing the items directly through social media. And so it's those, that paradox almost that we talk about when it comes to data privacy, that when it comes down to it, I think it is certainly salient to consumers depending on what type of decision they're making. But in terms of the actions that they want to happen, they would prefer companies and regulators to shoulder the majority of that responsibility.
I was going to say, I think Alex brings up a great point about how personal it feels to you. So when I think about that, I think of those controversies, the stories that came out about, say, the people's cameras in their children's rooms being hacked, and how terrifying those very individual stories are, versus, you're right, Facebook. Okay, there's a massive breach of Facebook. How does that really harm me on an individual level? While that visceral feeling of, a random person could hack into my child's bedroom, that's a whole different ballgame for people. So you really have to make them believe that won't happen to them.
No, good points all around. And I think, that's sort of an interesting point as to, how people frame their expectations of what brands can do. I was actually in preparation for this, recording this podcast, I was looking at some of our global consumer research. And one of the questions that we've got in that one of the statements rather, it is important to know that companies protect my personal information, e.g. financial data, medical data, etc. Now, across Asia Pacific, every country, consumers over-index in agreement with that statement. So obviously there's a point where consumers really do expect companies, brands, to shoulder a burden. So to that point, how do we think that data privacy might affect how brands communicate and engage with consumers in the future in each region, either in the physical space or online? And what do we think that might even mean for us in the market research industry? Woon, have you got any thoughts on that kind of brand communication and engagement with consumers?
Yes. So one positive thing is that we see that consumers are giving more importance to data privacy, right? So that's that gives like a positive note to the future. But the thing is, in Thailand, the knowledge is still pretty limited. So what brands are supposed to do right now is giving more education and, being more transparent about how the data is being adopted, So when I said that education is very important right now, is that because right now, even Thais, they know that brands are the brands need them to use data in order to tailor products or services that are more suitable to their needs. But the thing is, they don't really know how the brands collect the data and how it's going to be adopted. And, how are they going to be sure that it's not going to be misused? So this kind of thing, it has to, it's the brands have to take action in order to make consumers feel that, okay, this is not going to be used in a wrong way. And they have to be transparent to show this as well. And I feel like, after brands know how to use data, and then at the back of their house, they can collect data and optimize the data. And then after that, what's going to happen with market research agencies like us, Sometimes when our clients can do do really well with the data, it means that market researchers, we have to be even more, expertise in what we can offer them. So it means that maybe we cannot just collect data and offer what we have. It has to go beyond than that, which means that we have to show more expertise and how the data is going to be optimized in even more advanced ways, this kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's going to be a more challenging future for market research.
I think that you did bring up some really interesting points, Woon, and especially about how companies can best optimize their data collection practices in the face of increased perceived regulation. That is something that we're anticipating. And an example that really jumps to mind for me is that Apple's iOS update 14.5 that recently came out allowed consumers the ability to ask apps not to track them. And so for those who aren't, maybe listeners that aren't familiar with using iPhones, essentially what happens is a pop-up window comes up in the middle of the screen and says that this app wants to track your data. And you have two options: allow it to track or ask the app not to track it. And kind of preliminary data or consumer feedback since this feature has come out, and this data was gathered through third-party services, shows that an overwhelming majority of consumers select the option, for apps not to track them. And we're talking above 85% of users. And so, like Rebecca talked about with the GDPR, and that there's high engagement, especially in the opt-out or versus opt-in, and it's beyond that consumers prefer, I don't really want to read through all the details. I just want to know that I'm not being tracked, at least to a certain extent. And so for the US, what I am anticipating is kind of phases almost, I guess, of backlash against certain technologies. And I think initial backlash will be against specific technologies that are very apparent in that they are monitoring consumers. And so thinking about surveillance technologies, specifically facial recognition, which has been getting a lot of recognition in data privacy circles about, how ethically it can or cannot be used. And so I think those sort of inklings about I can pinpoint a certain technology that I'm unsure about will grow into consumers wanting more personal agency over their data, so that they can more tangibly assess the rewards, whether they are material or not, of sharing their data. And so I think that will inherently alter the relationship between, survey respondents and market researchers and consumers and brands, because it's going to be a little bit more perceived of an involved conversation where consumers have more control, and that it's not just kind of necessarily that a brand or a company can bank on a blanket of consumers adopting the same behavior.
Yeah, I think that's really sums up really well. And the idea of these opt-out options are just, people are going to expect them increasingly, and we're seeing them more. Or we're seeing, say, Google allow promises of automatically deleting your search history and your data after a certain amount of time. I think it's also interesting to think what this means for advertising overall as consumers become more aware of these practices. And certainly our consumer data has shown that targeted advertising based on browsing history or purchasing history is the digital advertising people are most uncomfortable with. And that obviously reframes things a lot for advertisers, because the last thing you want if you're advertising someone is that they get uncomfortable or they get on edge, because they're like, oh, I don't want you tracking me. I don't want you knowing that I just went to that website. So that sort of, you can't just be so obvious with it, which I think in these sort of initial stages of targeting based on browsing history, they've been pretty overt, and that I think can increasingly lead to quite a negative response. So you have to be more upfront about how you've chosen to target this advert to them, be more subtle with it probably to try and prevent that kind of that instinctive reaction, negative reaction. And then also probably more contextual advertising needs to take place around the content you're advertising alongside. So it's more based on this content we're showing to people, what does that emotion is that invoking? And we're going to try and tailor our advert to match that, rather than just being like, you went to this website, I'm going to track you, and sort of in a fairly overt way. So I think brands really have to think about how they're advertising to people to make sure they're not pushing up against some of these buttons that are increasingly an issue for people.
Thanks for that. That raised several interesting points for me, actually. I think the one particularly about, I think, Alex, you mentioned it, about the opt-out and the opt-in. It raises questions about, do most people, or do all people, or are there certain groups who perhaps don't know when they're opting in or out? So I saw an example recently of a trends observation that we published from Japan, and it was about a company that had created a vending machine that you could pay for. You can make your choice and everything using your face. You don't need to touch the thing at all. So that raises questions, as we said, about sort of facial recognition technology and so on. And the idea behind it, I think, is that it's no touch, so it's hygienic. But it does raise questions about those who have access to the technology and who understand the data situation. I'm thinking primarily here about sort of perhaps older generations who are less technically savvy. Again, obviously, the rules are being brought in to sort of bring those guidelines to companies and brands. But do you think there are certain consumer groups who might be a bit more vulnerable in terms of their data privacy that brands perhaps should take more care of?
Absolutely. older consumers definitely jump out to me, and we know that that's no fault of their own, that, communications, especially in regards to technology messaging, focuses on younger consumers. And when we talk about digitally savvy consumers here at Mintel, we are always talking about a psychographic, and so it could be of any age, of any identity, and it's really just behavior based. And so I do think that companies and brands will have to be very intentional about education and information messaging around their data collection practices, because it's not as though that companies have never shared any information, about it, but really it was the consumer understanding wasn't there. They would say, well, first of all, I'm not going to read, a 50-page document about it. And second of all, how much of that am I going to understand realistically anyway? And so I think there are definitely certain consumer groups that their base level of knowledge is probably a little bit lower than other groups. But I think across the board, many consumers are forthcoming and saying what they know they don't know. And an example that jumps to mind is last year, students around the world were really questioning the invasiveness of remote exam proctoring technologies. And students at dozens of universities, including in the US and Canada, actively petitioned against the use of these proctoring technologies. And so this was obviously exceptionally salient when all of education was moved digitally. But even prior to that, it's kind of difficult to conceptualize that a global group who grew up digitally native largely has a greater understanding, often in part due to their curriculum, of how technology works. That's going to motivate their expectations of that. And so we can hopefully assume that if other consumers had that similar level of knowledge, that they would have similar sentiments.
I think it brings up some interesting points about the implementation of GDPR, which is in theory meant to be pretty uniform, and in practice is very complicated. And so each website is going to present you very different options, some of which are very simple, opt-in, out. Some are much more complicated and want to direct you elsewhere. And there has been, I think, a progression towards the simplicity, because that pushback of I don't understand this, and I know you're trying to make it so I don't understand this, so that I don't simply opt out. And so we are seeing that, but it does, and I think that will, obviously is a driver of what we're going to see more and more from different players. I also, just when you mentioned the word hygiene, I was like, yep, COVID, we haven't talked about it yet, but the idea of how that changes so many of the dynamics. If you're thinking about all the consumers who have now had to spend a lot more time online, and also embracing technology that they haven't had to before, whether it's using QR codes or going contactless, or all these factors that play a role into your digital data and your digital footprint, that they've been forced to embrace for safety reasons, or because the government's sort of pushing them. And I think that sort of helps, it speeds up their transition to being very digitally orientated, and also pushes these conversations further forward, as COVID overall pushes these conversations about what can the government check about our health records. With now our COVID passports, vaccine passports, raise a whole other host of issues of what we're willing to give up to get freedoms back, I guess.
I think it's pretty similar to what Rebecca and Alexis mentioned. I think simplifying the message, how to make it, for consumers to understand what this is talking about, for them to okay, this is yes or no for them. And that's one of the most important thing. And another thing is that perhaps brands can reinforce, show them how the data has been protected. Maybe we can talk about the system, the software, or anything that has been, that could help endorse the level of the quality, to give more confidence, this kind of thing. Especially, I think like Rebecca said, we are now in the time of pandemic when people are giving more importance to health and having this social distancing thing. So we are using more digital platforms. And in Thailand, we have entered in this aging society world, which means that we are using more digital tools more than ever. So that means we are going to adopt more digital devices in the future, and that's going to increase the issue around data privacy for sure. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. And it leads me nicely into my last question, which is focusing very much on the future. So we've seen sort of various aspects through our discussion about data privacy, and we started off talking about ransomware, but we know that certain parts of data control are not always under control by brands, or what happens to data. So what do you think in looking into the future that will be the key drivers of consumer expectation around data privacy, and what will they be demanding brands are doing in the future?
I think it firstly just got to feel protected. So initially there is an understanding, or assuming there has been, that some of these brands have been hacked and that isn't necessarily 100% in your control. I think acceptance of that will go down as they expect that these major corporations in particular should be able to protect them. They know how powerful they are. So firstly, the consumers are just going to expect that these controversies decline, and that if a brand keeps getting caught by them, then that is going to be a problem. But as I always caveat everything, saying it depends on what the brand is and how useful what they offer is, and it's their alternative. So it'll be a problem. They might get angry at them. If it's Google, it's very hard to not use Google. So as an example. So taking on hacks is quite a tricky one, because obviously every company is going to be doing what they can to protect themselves and protect their consumer data from that, because they understand the consequences. Before that, outside of that, I think it goes back to what we talked about. It's consent and control, and giving people insight and just being transparent. People hate is being manipulated, and they hate feeling being taken advantage of and feeling that a company's using them, rather than just accept everyone is in this sort of social contract. We understand that to get some digital features and content, we have to, for free in particular, you maybe have to give some things up for advertising purposes. For other people, understand that that's a contract they are willing to enter into. They just don't want to do it in a way where they feel that there's a complete asymmetric division of knowledge. So they just want to feel like they can take a little bit of that control back that maybe they haven't felt they've had before.
Yeah, that's a lot of great points, Rebecca, about how consumers are feeling. And for me, in line with what you were saying, a lot of how this affects, brands and companies is that in any instance of a data attack, so to speak, whether it's a data breach of a lot of consumers or just a single consumer, or just some sort of expose about data collection practices, whether it was actually a breach or not, those will almost always be the fault of companies, organizations, brands, and consumers' eyes. Consumers are going to be highly unlikely to say like, oh, well, that's what I get for not changing my password, or something of that sort. It will always be the fault of the brand or the company. And so in that regard, the brand or the company has to be the most, robust and proactive in protecting consumer data, because as we've talked about, consumers are largely reactive when it comes to data privacy. And so they will, if they are given an opt-in, opt-out option, they will react to that and do that, but they're less likely to be proactive and then seek out other solutions about how to safeguard themselves. And so the expectations for consumers, especially speaking for the US, is definitely going to be on the part of regulators, companies, and brands to set the standard for what it means to operate, ethical data collection practices, what that means for consumers, and hopefully for consumers in that regard, that means that most of their habits and conveniences aren't disrupted to a great extent.
Sometimes we just want to be convenient. We just want to feel convenient. Sometimes we don't really take care of password or anything. Like every access, it's just the same, or we haven't really, spent like attention on it. Maybe brands or, some people need to reinforce that this is important. And this is the first thing that consumers like us can do in order to protect our data, our privacy. So yeah, maybe this is the point that we have to be more focusing on as well in order to reach this point. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So we're slight disagreement there. Some are saying it's all on the brands and everybody's going to expand the brands, but when you've got it, we need to take some responsibility for ourselves, which is probably an even way of looking at it. But sadly, that is all we have time for at the moment. So thank you very much for your contributions today. Thank you for listening. Please make sure you subscribe, rate and review this podcast on iTunes or on any other platform you get your podcast from. Please spread the word and we'll catch you next time for a new episode of Little Conversation. If you want to know more about Mintel, who we are and what we do, head over to mintel.com and follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. And check out our blog for even more insights from our analysts.